In the brutal winter of the Rocky Mountains, survival often hinges on the smallest of inventions. For one mountain man, a humble tin can stove would become the key to keeping his cabin warm through the most unforgiving nights. But what seemed like a simple solution to his harsh reality would soon turn into something far more extraordinary, changing the way wilderness dwellers face the bitter cold for decades to come. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this ignite your passion for survival, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode brings a secret from the frontier that will leave you amazed. The biting cold of the Rockies was unforgiving, even for a man like William Hayes. A grizzled mountain man in his mid-40s, he'd lived in these mountains long enough to understand the dangers that came with winter's deep freeze. His cabin stood at the edge of a dense forest, isolated from the nearest settlement by miles of snow-packed trails. On the outside, it appeared like any other frontier cabin, simple, practical, built with the basics needed to survive. But on the inside, William had spent months crafting something that set him apart from the other men who braved the wilds of the Rockies. William sat by the fire, his worn fur-lined coat tight around his frame, his thick beard and hair matted with frost from the cold that clung to him even inside. The wind howled through the gaps between the logs, its icy breath sneaking into the cabin, threatening to undo the heat he had so carefully coaxed from the small stove in the corner. For years, William had made do with the simple tools of survival, his rifle, his traps, and the sturdy log cabin that had kept him safe through many winters. But the nights were always the hardest. The wind would scream through the pines, rattling the cabin's windows, and the cold would seep into his bones no matter how many blankets he piled on. One thing became clear: the fire alone was never enough. He needed something better. It was one evening in the middle of a fierce snowstorm that the idea came to him. The wood stove he had used for years was functional, but it wasn't efficient enough to battle the mountain's bitter cold. It burned through wood too quickly, and the heat would never last long enough to keep the cabin warm through the long, freezing nights. That night, as he sat hunched over the fire, warming his stiff hands, the solution began to form in his mind. A simple metal stove, but with an innovation he'd never seen before. Something that could draw in the heat more efficiently and keep the fire burning longer. Something small but powerful enough to warm his cabin for hours on end. With the storm still raging outside, William felt an urgency like never before. He had survived in the wilderness for years, but this winter, he realized, might be his last if he didn't find a better way to stay warm. He had no formal training in metalworking or engineering, but he knew enough about the land and the tools he had at his disposal to make something work. The next morning, while the snow piled up against his cabin's door, William ventured into the forest. He needed supplies: tin, scrap metal, and anything he could find that might work for the project he had in mind. Hours later, he returned with a bundle of materials: scrap metal, an old tin can, some iron brackets, and his most trusted tool, a hammer. For the next few days, William worked in solitude, his focus unbroken as he hammered, cut, and shaped the metal into the stove of his dreams. When it was finished, it wasn't much to look at. A tin can, hollowed out and fitted with a chimney and a small door. But William believed in his design. He set it up in the corner of the cabin, stoking it with dry wood and watching as it came to life. To his surprise, the heat began to fill the cabin almost immediately. It burned longer, hotter, and with far less wood than the old stove had ever done. For the first time in his life, William Hayes knew that the cold would not claim him. The days that followed were a true test. The storm raged on, as fierce as any winter had ever been. The wind howled outside, rattling the trees and shaking the roof. Inside, William's new stove burned bright, its glow dancing off the log walls, casting long shadows across the small cabin. For the first time, he felt warmth that lasted, that filled the corners of the room without fading, without leaving cold spots. Each evening he fed the stove with wood he'd gathered from the nearby forest, watching as the fire hummed and crackled, the heat continuing to radiate out from the tin structure. It wasn't just the stove that amazed him. It was the effect it had on his life. The nights weren't so long anymore. The cold didn't creep into his bones, making it impossible to sleep. He could rest for the first time, feeling the warmth of the stove in his skin, his muscles no longer aching from the unrelenting chill of the wilderness. But there was a more pressing concern that had been lingering in the back of his mind. Would the stove stand the test of time? Could it endure more than just a few cold nights? This wasn't the sort of thing you could easily replace in the wild. If his stove broke or failed, he would be left to face the mountain's wrath once more, without the means to defend himself. So William set out to put it to the ultimate test. He decided to let the stove burn for as long as it could, feeding it more wood than he would ever normally use, allowing it to burn through the night without interruption. If it could survive this, if it could keep the cabin warm through the worst of the cold, then William would know he had something truly valuable. As the hours passed, the stove continued to burn steady. William's body relaxed. He no longer had to huddle next to the fire, constantly poking at the logs to keep them from dying down. The cabin stayed warm, the heat radiating through the walls, filling every corner. When morning came, he woke to a sight that nearly took his breath away. The stove was still going, still glowing with a soft, warm light. And the cabin? It was as if winter had forgotten it altogether. The cold no longer had dominion inside. For the first time, the harshness of the mountain was held at bay. William sat back in his chair, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. He had done it. He had created something that not only kept him alive, but had transformed his way of life in the wilderness. And as he watched the fire flicker in the stove, he knew that this invention would spread. It wasn't just about surviving the cold anymore, it was about mastering it. William Hayes had never been one to seek attention, but his simple tin can stove had caught the interest of his fellow trappers in a way he hadn't expected. Over the weeks that followed its successful test, William's cabin became a quiet refuge for those braving the mountain's cold. The weather had only grown harsher, the snow deeper, and more men began to venture into his neck of the woods, looking for shelter from the relentless winter storm. They came with questions, eager to know how a single man had managed to tame the cold so efficiently. The first to stop by was Thomas Blackwell, a trapper who had been operating in the same region for over a decade. He arrived one bitter afternoon, stumbling into William's cabin with his face frozen from the wind and his boots caked with snow. Thomas had been a fixture of the frontier, known for his ruggedness and sharp mind, yet even he seemed caught off guard when he saw how warm William's cabin was. "Well, I'll be damned," Thomas muttered as he stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. The warmth was immediate, enveloping him like a thick blanket. He quickly stripped off his damp layers and sat near the stove, his eyes wide with disbelief. William, who had been sitting quietly by the fire, glanced up. "It'll last a while. Keeps the place warmer than the fireplace ever did." Thomas looked at the stove with a mix of admiration and curiosity. "That's a hell of a thing you've built there. Where'd you get the idea?" William shrugged. "Had to do something. The old stove wasn't cutting it. Needed something that would last through the night." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "How much wood does it burn, though? I'm always worried about running out in the winter." "This one. It doesn't burn much at all," William said, his eyes reflecting the warmth of the fire. "You can feed it a little here and there, but it'll keep going for hours." The two men fell into a quiet conversation about the cabin's construction, the weather, and the ongoing challenges of surviving in the wild. As they spoke, William couldn't help but notice how Thomas kept glancing at the stove, clearly impressed. It was a quiet satisfaction for William, the knowledge that he had created something practical, something that worked. By the time evening had come and the stove had settled into its rhythmic heat, Thomas had made up his mind. "I'm heading back to camp tomorrow, but I'll be spreading word of this," he said. "There's a few others in these parts, and they'll want to know about that stove of yours." William didn't argue. In the back of his mind, he knew that what he had made was more than just a personal solution. It could change the way men lived out here in the mountains. He just never expected it to happen so quickly. The following weeks were a blur of snowstorms and freezing nights. As promised, Thomas had spread word of William's heater, and it wasn't long before others began to make the trek to his cabin, eager to see for themselves what kind of magic he had worked with the simple stove. At first it was just a trickle of men, a trapper here, a prospector there. But as the cold deepened, more came, each one, at first skeptical, left with a new sense of hope and a piece of knowledge that could change their lives. One such man was James O'Rourke, a grizzled veteran of the frontier who had been known to survive some of the harshest winters without so much as a complaint. But the winter of 1837 had hit him harder than any other. He had spent the last few days sheltering in a makeshift lean-to with nothing but a small fire to keep him warm. His clothes, though well worn, were no match for the intensity of the cold, and his hands were numb from hours spent trying to maintain the fire. When he finally arrived at William's cabin, he was barely able to stand, his body hunched against the cold. William greeted him as he always did, with silence and a simple gesture to the stove. James didn't say much at first, just gratefully stripping off his heavy, wet layers and collapsing in front of the warmth. "You've got to be one of the last ones I expected to see this winter," William said after a few minutes, noting how James seemed unusually exhausted. "Damn cold's been killing me," James muttered, his voice hoarse. "Tried to make do, but there's only so much one man can do in these conditions. That stove you've got there, is it really as good as people say?" William only nodded, not one to boast. "Keeps the place warm. I haven't had a bad night since I made it." James glanced at the stove and then back at William, a hint of skepticism still in his eyes. But after an hour, as the heat from the stove soaked into his tired muscles, he began to believe in its magic. "I'm going to try it out tonight," James said, standing up slowly. "I don't know what you've got there, Hayes, but it might just be the answer." As the evening wore on, the two men sat in silence, the crackling of the stove filling the air. James couldn't help but admire the simple ingenuity of the design. It was a far cry from the clunky stoves most trappers relied on. The heat was consistent, and the cabin seemed to hold on to it, no matter how fierce the wind howled outside. By morning, when James rose, the cabin was still warm, and the fire had burned steadily through the night with minimal attention. He stepped outside into the bitter cold, testing the air, and smiled grimly to himself. "It worked," he muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. It actually worked. He looked over at William, who was already preparing his gear for the day. "You've done something here, Hayes. I don't know what kind of trick you've pulled, but it's better than anything I've ever seen." The pride William felt was quiet, but it was there. He had invented something out of necessity, but now it was something more, a lifeline for those who had no choice but to brave the wilds of the mountains. And as James packed up to leave, he knew he would spread the word about the stove, about the warmth it brought, and how one simple man had found a way to survive the cold that had killed so many before him. The days grew shorter as winter deepened, and the word of William Hayes's tin can stove spread like wildfire across the frontier. Every trapper, prospector, and isolated settler in the region seemed to be talking about the remarkable heater that had withstood the harshest snowstorms and kept its maker warm through endless nights. It wasn't long before more men started arriving at William's cabin, eager for a glimpse of the stove that had saved so many from the bitter cold. At first, William had been content to share the knowledge with only a few, but soon the requests became impossible to ignore. Some men arrived with pieces of scrap metal in hand, hoping that William might show them how to fashion their own stoves. Others brought goods and supplies to trade, determined to get their hands on one of these life-saving inventions. The cabin, once a quiet refuge, became a hub of activity, the constant flow of visitors creating a bustle that William wasn't used to. One afternoon, as he sat near the stove, whittling a piece of wood for his next project, a tall, rugged man walked in. His thick coat was covered in snow, his boots caked with ice, and his beard was as wild as the mountains themselves. He dropped a bundle of pelts on the ground beside him and took a deep breath, filling the small cabin with the scent of wood and leather. William glanced up and nodded, recognizing the man immediately. "Jeb Simmons," he said, rising from his seat. "What brings you out this far?" Jeb's eyes sparkled with the same kind of curiosity that had brought so many before him. "Heard you've got something here that could change the way we survive in these mountains. That stove of yours? I need one, and I'm willing to trade." William didn't respond immediately, but he studied Jeb with a certain calculation. The man was known for his no-nonsense attitude, and he had a reputation for getting things done, especially when it came to survival. William had little doubt that Jeb could handle himself in the harshest of conditions, but there was something about the way he asked that made William pause. Jeb sat down by the stove, his large hands rubbing together for warmth. "Look, Hayes, I don't have much to offer, but I've got furs. Good ones, from this season. You know the kind of cold we're facing. If we don't have something better than what we've got, we're all going to freeze before the end of the month." William studied Jeb for a moment longer, then nodded. "I'm not selling these stoves," he said slowly. "But if you want to know how to make one, I'll show you. I can't guarantee it'll be easy, but if you're willing to put in the work, I'll teach you what I know." Jeb grinned, a flash of genuine gratitude in his eyes. "Fair enough. Just show me the way, and I'll do the rest." Over the following days, William shared his process with Jeb. He showed him the delicate art of shaping the metal, fitting it together with precision, and how to ensure the stove would burn steadily without consuming too much wood. Jeb was a quick learner, and before long he had his own stove ready to take back to his camp. When Jeb finally left William's cabin, he didn't take the stove with him. Instead, he promised to return in a few weeks with the fruits of his labor. "I'll be back to show you what I've built," he said, tipping his hat, "and I'll be sure to spread the word even further." As the door closed behind Jeb, William's thoughts turned inward. He knew his humble invention was already beginning to change lives. But it was also becoming something larger than he had ever anticipated. The demand for the stoves was growing rapidly, and he couldn't help but wonder how long he could keep up with it all. The harshest of the winter storms had come and gone, leaving a thick layer of snow that blanketed the mountains for miles. The wind, once a merciless force, seemed to settle down, the silence of the wilderness broken only by the occasional call of an eagle or the distant sound of snow falling from the trees. William Hayes stood at the edge of his cabin, looking out at the pristine, untouched landscape. It was a world of stark beauty, a place where life could be as unforgiving as it was magnificent. But inside his cabin, the warmth from his stove had made all the difference. It had been nearly 2 months since he had built the first tin can heater, and its success had far surpassed his expectations. The men who had come to him for advice and guidance had returned with their own versions of the stove, each one a testament to the ingenuity of the frontier. What had started as one man's struggle against the cold had blossomed into something much greater, a collective effort to survive the unforgiving winters of the Rockies. William had spent the last few weeks receiving visitors, sharing his knowledge, and helping others with the assembly of their own stoves. The requests had come in from all corners of the mountain region, and each time he helped another man build a stove, he felt a sense of pride knowing that he was contributing to something that could save lives. Even the most skeptical of his neighbors had come around, recognizing the practicality of the design and its ability to keep cabins warm through even the longest nights. But now, as he stood alone in his cabin, he couldn't help but reflect on the solitude that had once felt so comfortable to him. The visits had become a constant in his life, and while he was glad to help, he had begun to miss the quiet moments he once spent by the stove, thinking and reading in peace. The door creaked open behind him, and a familiar voice called out, "William, you've got company." It was Jeb Simmons, back earlier than expected. William turned to face him, his expression unreadable. Jeb stepped inside, a proud smile on his face, as he carried something large and wrapped in cloth. "I told you I'd be back," Jeb said, his eyes twinkling with excitement, "and I've got something to show you." William didn't say a word as Jeb unwrapped the cloth, revealing a stove nearly identical to the one William had built months ago. The metal was shiny and smooth, and the design was perfect. It was clear that Jeb had taken every lesson to heart. "You've done well," William said simply, his voice full of quiet approval. "I couldn't have done it without you," Jeb replied. "But I've got a surprise for you. I've been building these stoves for others too. It's spreading faster than I ever thought it would. Word's getting out, and people are starting to trust it." The weight of Jeb's words settled over William like a warm blanket. The stove had started as a personal solution to a survival problem, but now it was something more. It wasn't just a tool, it was a lifeline, one that had brought the mountain men together in a way that hadn't happened before. They were no longer isolated by their individual struggles. They were united in the fight against the wilderness, working together to make sure that no one was left behind in the cold. For the first time in months, William allowed himself to relax. He had not only survived the winter, he had helped others survive as well. And in that simple act of sharing, he had discovered something more valuable than warmth, a sense of community and purpose that the cold could never take away. As the days turned to weeks and the weeks into months, the demand for William Hayes's stoves grew beyond what he could have imagined. Men from distant trapping posts, remote cabins, and even some nearby settlements began arriving at his door, asking for his help. Word had spread like wildfire, and what had once been a simple, solitary invention had now become a symbol of survival, something that no mountain man could afford to be without. At first, William had been content to teach others, to pass on his knowledge so that more men could stay warm through the brutal winter. But soon he realized the task had become a burden. Every day he had visitors, eager men with only one goal in mind, to learn the secret behind his heater. He had no time for his own work anymore. The snow was still falling, the traps still needed to be set, and the fires still had to be stoked. But William found himself overwhelmed by the demands of the growing community that depended on him. The first time he truly felt the weight of the situation was when a group of 4 men arrived one cold morning, looking ragged and exhausted. They had traveled from a nearby canyon where the storms had been particularly brutal. Their faces were gaunt, their clothes tattered, and their hands cracked from the cold. "We heard you've got a way to stay warm through these storms," one of them said, a deep-set weariness in his voice. "We're struggling out there. Our cabin's falling apart, and the firewood's nearly gone. If you've got a way to help us, we'll trade whatever we can." William studied them for a moment. Their desperation was clear. He could see it in their eyes, the kind of fear that came with knowing that death by cold was just one mistake away. But there was something in his gut that made him hesitate. He had helped many men in the past, but now it felt different. These men weren't asking for a lesson. They were asking for a solution. "How much wood do you have left?" William asked, his tone flat. "Not enough," came the grim reply. "Not nearly enough for the rest of the season. And our cabin, it's barely standing." The reality of their situation hit William hard. He knew what it was like to be at the mercy of the elements. He had been there once before, in the early days of his own struggle to survive. He couldn't let them freeze, not when he had the means to help. "All right," he said, sighing as he thought through his options. "I'll help you, but you'll need to work for it. I don't have much to spare, but I can show you how to build one of these stoves for yourselves." They agreed, desperate to do whatever it took to stay alive. For the next few days, William worked alongside them, showing them how to shape the metal, how to ensure the stove would burn long and steady, and how to set it up for maximum efficiency. It was hard, grueling work, and William found himself exhausted by the end of each day. But the stoves began to take shape, and as they were finished and the first fires were lit, William couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The warmth in the cabin spread, and the men who had once been on the brink of survival now had the means to thrive. But it was also a turning point for William. He couldn't keep up with the demand alone. The price of his innovation had become too high. He was giving away pieces of his life, his time, and his energy, and yet he couldn't ignore the pull of helping others. He realized that, in a way, the mountain had become a community, bound together by the cold and by the simple but powerful tools of survival. The winter of 1838 was different. It was harsher than any before it. The snow piled high, blanketing the mountains and turning the wilderness into an unforgiving labyrinth. For the men living in the frontier, the battle for survival had taken on new urgency. The cold had become more than just a discomfort. It was a constant gnawing presence, a reminder that the wilderness could claim anyone at any time. William had been spending more and more time at his cabin, working on new stoves and helping others when they arrived. But this year, he was prepared. He had anticipated a harsh season, and for the first time, he had stockpiled enough firewood to last. He had checked his traps early, ensuring that his supply of meat would be sufficient. He had even managed to keep the cabin secure, the walls and roof sturdy enough to withstand the worst of the storms. But despite all of his preparations, the winter had come for him in ways he hadn't expected. One evening, as he sat near the fire, reading a tattered journal he had found in a nearby town, the wind began to pick up. At first it was just a faint whisper, a soft rustle in the trees, but by nightfall, the howling winds were unrelenting. The storm was unlike anything he had ever witnessed, its fury almost unnatural. Snow whipped against the cabin's windows, the gusts so fierce that they rattled the walls. The fire in the stove crackled loudly, but even the heat it produced seemed to be pushed back by the cold outside. William stood up, his bones aching from the wear of the last few months, and walked to the door. He opened it a crack, just enough to peek outside, and was immediately hit by a blast of icy air. The snow was falling so thickly now that he could barely make out the trees just beyond the cabin. The storm was intense, unpredictable, and dangerous. He knew that if he wasn't careful, it could take him, just like it had taken so many others. But his cabin was built for this: the stove, the walls, the foundation, everything he had designed, everything he had spent so many long days perfecting, was about to be put to the ultimate test. He stepped back inside and watched as the storm intensified. His stove, still burning steadily, stood as a silent guardian in the corner, keeping the cold at bay. William smiled faintly. In this moment it was clear. His work, his struggle, and his obsession had been worth it. The mountain had thrown its worst at him, and yet here he was, warm and safe, surrounded by the warmth of his cabin. As the hours wore on, the storm continued to rage outside, but inside, William knew that he had created something that could stand the test of time. The stove was more than just a way to survive the cold. It was a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and the quiet determination of a man who had refused to let the wilderness break him. The storm would pass, and when it did, William would go on. Not just as a survivor, but as a man who had helped others survive too. And in the midst of the unrelenting cold, he had found something even more valuable than warmth, a legacy built on fire and iron. The storm eventually subsided, leaving a quiet blanket of snow across the mountains. William stood at the door of his cabin, looking out over the wilderness that had shaped him. The stove had passed its test, just as he had. Word of his invention had spread far and wide, and the men who had come to him for help had now become stewards of his creation, ensuring it would live on long after the winter passed. He could hear the sound of axes and hammers in the distance as others built their own stoves. A small, proud smile touched his lips. His work wasn't just a means of survival, it had become a lasting legacy, woven into the very fabric of frontier life. And while he didn't seek fame, the knowledge that his creation would help generations to come filled him with quiet pride. Years passed and the frontier continued to evolve. William's stove became a standard, his design improving lives in the harshest conditions. But by 1840, he was no longer a young man, and the call of the mountains grew quieter. His time as a mountain man was fading. One last winter, he tested his stove against the might of the Rockies, as if one final battle between man and nature was necessary. The stove endured, as it always had, keeping him warm through the coldest nights. As he sat back, content in the warmth, William realized that the wilderness, once a place of unrelenting danger, had become his home. His legacy, built from necessity, had transformed not only his life, but the lives of many others.